Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one where we dive into tons of interesting stories and books, and another where we just dive into tons of interesting topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, OK, let's learn all about the Boston Tea Party. This podcast is being introduced in the summer of 2026. We will have a series of podcast episodes all about that amazing year back 251 years ago, 1775. And then, yes, 250 years ago in 1776. But believe it or not, it all started back in 1770 with the Boston Massacre. You can go back to my previous episode on that. But here's my plan. Each of these episodes, it's not about the one event. In this case, 1773, December 16th, the Boston Tea Party. They threw all this tea into the Boston Harbor. We will talk about all the events leading up to this. In this case, for this episode, what was going on for 3 years prior to this next big event? And then as we go forward, throughout us declaring independence, all the battles and the major events that happened during the Revolutionary War, and then us becoming a country. The idea is, again, you can go to one 15 to 20-minute podcast episode and get everything you need to know the interesting, fascinating parts of our American history. But today, we got to go to this party. Was it a party? Was it about tea? Okay, let's learn. I mean, when most people think, hey, why do we break away from our mother country, England? It was about taxation without representation. But really, was it? Okay, yes, the key thing was representation, and taxes were a big issue. But in 1770, when the Boston Massacre had happened, it was only 7 years before that we had finally beaten the French in this new continent, and great feelings were all around. But there was a problem, and it was a big one. King George and our country, England, we didn't have any money left. We had borrowed so much to beat France. And for the first time, our colonies were taxed. But if King George had just come to us and had a meeting of the minds, would we even be talking today about the United States of America? It's a great question, because this was the big issue. And believe it or not, by 1773, tea that was arriving in Boston was actually less expensive than before. Parliament had made tea cheaper. So instead of celebrating, thousands of colonists actually were more angrier than they ever were. Why? Because this wasn't about tax, this story about our arguments with England. It had to do with the right to make laws. Who had the right to tax? And who had the right to control trade? And probably more importantly than anything else, it was our future. Here we are now. Again, big point here. King George is not just a few miles away. He's across an ocean, 2 to 3 months away in some cases by the time you ended up communicating with each other. This is a big factor. And we were the growing teenager about to become an adult. And we're not looking for our parents to tell us what to do. There was this constant stress, arguments, no communication. Yeah, the communication was there, like I said, but really, could this survive when you're trying to talk and it would take 2 months to get back and forth? Imagine that. That's what the reality was during this time. And ironically, in the immediate aftermath of the Boston Massacre, Parliament and King George actually backed down. It happened. The massacre happened because Britain was enforcing all these series of taxes known as the Townshend Acts. They were passed in 1767, and they placed taxes on imports. And it wasn't just tea. It was glass, lead, paper, paint, And again, the idea was that the colonists had no elected representatives in Parliament that helped shape these laws, that had an input in making these laws. So faced with a lot of boycotts in the colonies and really a lot of economic pressure from British merchants who were losing business, Parliament said, okay, fine. They actually, believe it or not, voted to repeal all those taxes except tea. And when did they vote to repeal those taxes? The exact same day, March 5th, 1770, when the Boston Massacre happened. But of course, no one knew because, as I've said many times, it took weeks to get news back and forth, and the colonists didn't even know about it. But the key thing is they reserved the right to tax without any representation, and the one tax that they said we are still going to put through is on tea. And this was the beginning of the end of the English crown in the New World. Now let's talk about tea. You may be thinking, what's the big deal? Well, people didn't drink water back then. They didn't. And everyone drank tea at this point. It originally was for rich families, but now everyone drank it, even children. They drank weak tea because it was safer than drinking untreated water. It was big business. Originally, it came from China all the way into England, packed into 400-pound large wooden chest. And who controlled most of this business throughout the world? A lot of people don't know this, but this was so much of the factor of why these issues came to bear. It was all about the East India Company. And yeah, when you talk about giant corporations back then, this company was more than Apple, Amazon, and Walmart. It was all those combined. It started in the 1600s, and then 100 years later, it was huge. It owned hundreds of ships. It maintained its own army. It negotiated treaties. It minted coins. It governed millions of people throughout the world, especially in India. It was like its own country. No doubt a future episode. But here's the issue. By 1770, it became almost too big for its own good. It was in serious trouble. It was fighting wars in India. It was spending too much money. It was accumulating debt. And it didn't have enough cash. It was bleeding. And what was also happening at the same time? All this tea was sitting in factories and sitting in warehouses, and it wasn't being sold. If the tea is not being purchased, the company is going out of business, and the same thing would happen to the government because the government and huge investors in England were the ones that were financing it. Something had to be done. Parliament stepped forward. What was the solution? The Tea Act of 1773, where I mentioned that they still instituted the one tax on the colonists. But here's the thing about this act. Yes, it was about maintaining a tax. The tax already existed, though. The Tea Act said, no, this is what will happen going forward. And this was the key point about why the colonists were so angry. It changed who could sell the tea. Normally, the East India Company sold tea through wholesalers in Britain. Middlemen purchased it. Then other merchants bought it. This is what was happening throughout the years here in America. So the Tea Act eliminated all of this, eliminated all these middlemen, including Hancock. It said now the British East India Company had a legal monopoly to ship and sell all this surplus tea directly to the colonies through its own appointed agents, thereby, like I said, bypassing the colonial merchants and basically forcing consumers to pay this tax. And here again is the ironic part of it. Because you eliminated all these middlemen, the tea was cheaper. But everyone in the colonies saw the ruse. They saw right through what was happening. It wasn't about the tea now being cheaper. It was about who can make these new laws. Yes, he was propping up the East India Company, but it was more about King George and Parliament putting through laws without asking, and the colonists were furious. So this is the environment in Boston that allowed this group to be formed. They were the Sons of Liberty. This was the name they gave themselves, but they were people all across all socioeconomic parts of the society: merchants, craftsmen, printers, sailors, dock workers, lawyers, and political leaders. And one of the biggest voices is a guy you may know, not John Adams, but Samuel Adams, his cousin. And at the time, he really wasn't anybody special. It wasn't like he had a lot of money. It wasn't like he was a military hero, but he had the talent to organize people, and he could be persuasive. I mean, again, here we are 3 years after the Boston Massacre, and the area around Boston and this Liberty Tree where they would get together and talk covertly. It was becoming a powder keg underneath the surface, but it was out and about and loud, and everyone was on edge. And here is what now was happening. The first shipment of tea from the British East India Company was coming in November of 1773. 46 tons, 342 chests of tea. November 28th. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. At today's prices, we're talking about tea worth over $1 million. As people sat there on the shore, who would know that the world was going to be changed forever? The ships docked at Griffin's Wharf. It wasn't really famous back then. It was just another spot for the ships to come in. Here's what happened. The clock started ticking right away. Under British law, a merchant ship carrying imported goods had 20 days to unload its cargo and pay the required tax, pay the required custom duties. If the duty wasn't paid by the deadline, custom officials had the legal authority to seize the cargo. More importantly, the ship could not simply turn around and sail away without official permission. The governor at the time was this fellow by the name of Thomas Hutchinson. He was in charge. He was not only overseeing Boston and the harbor, he was the governor of the entire colony of Massachusetts. He said the tax, the duty had to be paid, and nothing else would happen until that was the reality. The tea wasn't going back. But here's something else that a lot of people don't know. You remember the official merchants that could sell the tea? Well, 2 of them were Hutchinson's own sons. You talk about being a powder keg. Yeah, they accused him of having a personal financial interest in making sure the tea was unloaded. Hutchinson was in an impossible situation. He had the government behind him, but he knew he had to follow the law, but he also knew the numbers were against him, so much so that he and most of the government officials were out in the harbor behind this fortress on this island called Castle William. So as much as he tried to maintain order, everything was against him. Within hours of the Dartmouth's arrival, newspapers, handwritten notices, conversations throughout the city, church gathering, busy streets, corners, were all asking the same question: what are we going to do about this tea? In fact, large printed notices appeared throughout the town urging citizens to attend a public meeting. The response was through the roof. On November 29th, thousands of people descended on Faneuil Hall. They couldn't fit. It was overwhelmed, so they moved down to the Old South Meeting House. It's still there. At the time, it was the largest public building in all of Boston. There were 5,000 to 6,000 people inside and crowding outside. It was almost half of the entire population of Boston. Talk about attention convention. Back and forth they went, and again Samuel Adams was one of the leaders. He insisted, in fact, that they were looking for a peaceful solution. That's what they initially wanted to do. But back and forth they went with Hutchison. Notes were sent, and he kept coming back again and again and saying no. The ships could not leave Boston without the duty being paid. In the meantime, the captain of the ship, the captain of the Dartmouth, his name was James Hall, he was trapped. He couldn't sail away because the governor wouldn't issue clearance papers, and he couldn't unload the tea because thousands of people were surrounding the docks. And obviously, he just couldn't abandon the cargo because it belonged to the East India Company. The crews waited day after day, sitting there, watching, listening, wondering. Every morning they got up and they hoped the crisis would end. Instead, it got worse. I mean, what's often overlooked, you say, well, why didn't the government just enforce the tea coming off the ships? There were British naval vessels that were in the harbor, and there obviously were soldiers stationed down at the docks, but they just really didn't think that people would actually storm the ships and destroy the tea. They just expected protests, maybe even little riots, but they didn't point their cannons at the shore to cement the idea that this wasn't just clandestine, that it wasn't just something that was a surprise. Even Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, she wrote to him from Braintree outside of Boston, and she was commenting in a letter how unbelievable, exciting, and remarkable it was that this tea crisis was happening. Everyone was holding their breath as to what would happen next. And what happened next was December 16th. It was the final legal day. If the tea remained on board at midnight, customs officials could legally seize it. So here we were again in the Old South Meeting House. Samuel Adams got up and quieted the crowd down. He said, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." Was it code? Was it a signal? We don't know still to today. But almost immediately, as soon as he was done talking, movement began. No confusion, no panic, just movement. Men quietly left the meeting house. Others followed. Within minutes, groups were heading towards Griffin Wharf. Every participant knew what they were doing. Not everyone in that meeting house knew what they were going to do. But 100 to 150 men blackened their faces with soot. Some wore blankets. Others carried feathers in their hats. Most of them, in fact, disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. The British weren't fooled. They knew they were people from Boston, but they knew also that they were breaking the law, that they were risking their life, and they needed to move quick. And they were quiet. They had one purpose. They split into 3 groups. Each of the ships were boarded. The Boston Tea Party had begun. It was a little after 6 o'clock. They boarded the ships. The crew knew they were outnumbered. They didn't offer resistance. There were no cannons shot from the ships out in the harbor. The Sons of Liberty were not there to harm them. They told them that. Instead, they ordered them down below deck and told them to stay quiet. And they got to work. Axes and hatchets began smashing open the heavy wooden tea chest. As each chest was opened, the tea was dumped onto the deck. From there, they shoveled, they pushed, and they put the leaves over the sides of the ship into the icy harbor below, chest after chest, ship after ship, again and again. This was hard work, remember. I told you, these chests, some cases, weighed up to 400 pounds. They had to be hauled into position, broken apart, and emptied. They worked for 3 hours. No one was killed. The ship was not destroyed. No parts of the ship were damaged at all. It was all about eliminating the tea. Only one person was actually hurt. He was knocked unconscious by a falling tea crate, but that was it. He survived, and as a matter of fact, to bring home the point about it being all about the tea, one participant actually stuffed tea in his pocket, and he was immediately pounced on and punished. This was the story. And we don't know too many specifics about it because I mentioned this was breaking the law and no one spoke. No one talked about it. Immediately after, they all went about their business as if nothing happened. And for years later, we don't know who participated. No one spoke about it. But the tea was gone. It wasn't stolen. It was destroyed. Hutchinson was furious. British Customs surveyed the damage. The East India Company demanded compensation, but no one came forward to pay, and they didn't know who did it. All they knew is that the entire town, or most of the town, was responsible. So you know how the word spread? Yeah, through letters, through carriers, through couriers, and one of them was Paul Revere. He was one of the first one. Yeah, he got on his horse 2 years before his famous ride in 1775 in April. He carried the news of this party, this tea being thrown into the harbor to New York, and then he went further on to Philadelphia, so the colonies learned quickly. The news eventually reached King George, and he and Parliament were obviously livid. The result, it was a series of laws called the Coercive Acts. We call them something different. We call them the Intolerable Acts. The punishment was severe. The Crown closed Boston Harbor. Boston's economy immediately plummeted. Sailors lost their wages. Families obviously struggled. Dock workers lost their jobs. And yeah, all the merchants lost tons of business. But what King George didn't realize is all the other colonies supported and helped Boston. Instead of dividing the colonies, Britain actually united them. Years later, as we look back on this, who were the leaders? No doubt, we mentioned Sam Adams. No doubt, we mentioned John Hancock. There was Dr. Joseph Warren. There was Paul Revere. Lots of people, but no one was arrested. No one was convicted because, again, everything was silent. People went about their business. Now, there were claims years later that at this time, Samuel Adams and John Hancock were ordered to be arrested. But that wasn't really true. That actually didn't happen until 2 years later when General Thomas Gage received instructions to arrest Adams and Hancock. John Adams, Samuel Adams' cousin and our future second president, realized immediately what had happened. He called it a grandiose event and argued that this Tea Party would have consequences. He was right. It didn't start the revolution, but it started a chain reaction. The Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, then the First Continental Congress getting together, then Lexington and Concord, then Bunker Hill, then the Declaration of Independence, then 8 years of war, the American Revolution. So, was the Boston Tea Party really about taxes? Yes and no. The tax mattered, but not because it made tea expensive. In fact, Parliament had actually made legal tea cheaper. The deeper issue was this: could Parliament tax the colonies at all without their consent? If Americans accepted even a small tax simply because it was inexpensive and simply because, yeah, we're going to accept this monopoly from the East India Company, leaders feared that they would also be accepting Parliament's future unlimited authority to govern them. To Britain, this was a question of just maintaining the rule of law. To the colonists, though, it was a question of liberty and self-government. We and the colonists at this time had been here in this land for too many years all by herself, an ocean apart from our rulers. And yes, even though we fought against France, there was too much animosity built up with the king and parliament that there was no going back. Hey, you could argue that there were some merchants that certainly had ulterior motives. Smuggling had been profitable. The Tea Act threatened those profits. But thousands of ordinary colonists who had no financial stake also supported this resistance. History is rarely driven by one motive, one person alone. It was about principle. Yes, politics, yes, economics, but it was also about pride and honor and self-interest. This was all coming together in the streets of Boston at this time. Today, you can still go down to Griffin's Wharf and you can see replicas of the Dartmouth and the Beaver, and they have a museum right there. At the time, it wasn't called the Boston Tea Party. They called it the destruction of the tea, the waste of the tea, the action at Boston Beach. In fact, it wasn't until the early 1800s that the term ended up being used, and it wasn't about a party. Yeah, let's have a good time. It was about a group of men, a party. In fact, in July of 1826, one of the few men came forward at the age of 93. His name was Nicholas Campbell, and he admitted to being there. This newspaper outside of Boston, the Essex Register, published an interview with him. The silence was broken all these years later. And in the obituary, 4 years after the interview, the newspapers said he was one of, quote, the ever memorable Boston Tea Party, unquote. The name stuck, and it's still being used today. Friends, thanks for taking this journey, learning all about the Boston Tea Party. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We are on Facebook. We are on YouTube. We are on Spotify. We are on iHeartRadio. Any podcast platform, any podcast app on your phone, you can listen to us. You can listen to us on the computer. Hit that plus button in the top right-hand corner of Apple Podcasts. That will subscribe you to the podcast, and you can get the downloads every new episode. Love the reviews, love the ratings, keep them coming. Until next time, have fun and keep learning.